It is so good to have you with us again for another episode of Good Morning Eden. That's what I just said. But if you're just joining us today for the first time, my name's Josh.
I'm also Josh.
And we are both pastors and chaplains. And we are going through the Gospel of Mark to help us realign ourselves with seeing the world God's way of seeing things. So, bit by bit we're going through. And today we are up to Mark chapter 2, verse 18 through to Mark chapter 3, verse 6. And Josh is going to read for us.
No worries. So this is part 2 of our Jesus and Controversy section of Mark. We did part 1 last week, so if you haven't listened to that, feel free to jump on that podcast. But I'll lead us in the second part, starting in Mark 2, verse 18. Reading in the NIV, it says, "Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, 'How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?' Jesus answered, 'How can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins.' On the Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples walked along. They began to pick up some heads of grain, and the Pharisees said to them, 'Look, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?' He answered, 'Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.' Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, 'Stand up in front of everyone.' Then Jesus asked them, 'Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?' But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger, and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus."
Wow. What a time.
There's a lot there.
Yeah, there is. So we'll start just at the very beginning of that section. So John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, right? And Jesus and his disciples were not fasting. And, we kind of talked a little bit about last week. Jesus ate a lot of meals. Like, he loved to eat with people. It's like a thing. I'm sure we'll talk more about it further. So this is very in character. Other people are fasting and Jesus and his disciples are eating. But I guess just to give you a little bit of context to that. So the Mosaic law, Old Testament, it required only fasting on the Day of Atonement, which you can read about in Leviticus 16. And so there was just like one day a year that people were required to fast. Then after Babylonian captivity, there were 4 annual fast days, which you can read about in Zechariah 8. So sorry, I shouldn't say the Old Testament in that first part. The first 5 books of the Bible, and Leviticus just talks about one day, but then after Babylonian exile, in Zechariah 8 verse 19, you can read that there were 4 annual fast days. But the Pharisees love to scale up these laws to try and keep everything perfectly. And so by the time that Jesus was on the scene, the tradition had extended to every Monday and Thursday for those to wish to keep the law perfectly. So,
That's a lot.
What's that math? That's like 104, right? It's 2 days every week of the year.
Oh, yeah. So 104 fast days.
104 fasting days out of the year to do it perfectly.
Jeez.
Yeah, that's what the Pharisees were doing. So, that's a little bit of context as to why they were fasting and Jesus was like, not.
Yeah.
I don't know. Did you have anything to say about that?
No, basically what you said. And like you said, it wasn't a legal requirement, but it was one of those things where if you didn't do it, you're kind of looked upon like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
you were like the outsider if you didn't do that.
Yeah. And this is kind of, now again, fasting isn't a bad thing. I think it's a very overlooked discipline in the church today, especially, well, the Western church, I'll say at least. A lot of people don't fast because it sort of just feels like like an Old Testament kind of thing sometimes, or just like a Bible-y thing.
Yeah.
But it's a really powerful spiritual practice. Something like, and look, I don't fast all the time. I definitely don't fast every Monday and Thursday. Maybe I should, but but like I try and fast, at least like I have at least like a time of year that I fast to try and just keep me, or if I've got a big decision coming up or something I'm really seeking God on. So it's still a really powerful practice, but I think in these times and in these times in the Bible, but even times now, it can be very misunderstood.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Did you have much to share on fasting?
Yeah, I myself haven't, done fasting much in my life. I did it towards the end of last year a couple of times. And, I thought that fasting would be something where you just don't eat for a couple of hours or a couple of days. Yep. And then you would be able to hear the voice of God like perfectly. And so I think the first time that I fasted, I had that mindset of I'm going to be, listening and I'm just going to like hear God like I hear anyone else. And that didn't happen. And so it kind of discouraged me from fasting for a couple of years.
Yep.
And so towards the end of last year, I kind of rediscovered the purpose of fasting. And it's not necessarily you abstaining from food in order to hear God in like an audible voice, but it's more so just a surrendering of your life. Yeah. And it's using food to be like, hey, just like I need food to live, I actually need you to live more. And so I'm going to not eat my food. And every time I get a little bit hungry or think about food, I'm just going to pray and just remind myself that I need you. And it's more of surrender. And by the end of those days, I just felt really, really connected to God. And it wasn't like I heard audible voices. I fasted a lot about the youth ministry of our church for this year. And it wasn't like by the end of it, I had these revelations of all these amazing things are going to happen and these are my plans. But it more so was just I was stressed about this, but after the fast day that I had, I am no longer stressed about this because it's surrendered. And so that was really cool. And that is why fasting is, I think, an important practice that every Christian should try occasionally. And perhaps people do it more than I do, and that's great. But I think the fasting that's happening here in the Bible passage is something where, like you said before, they've missed the mark of what it's meant to be. And they've made it more of like a legalistic thing. And the moment that someone isn't doing it, even though it's not biblically mandated to do, they're immediately throwing daggers at Jesus. And I think that's where the problem and the tension lies, and why Jesus continues on what he says. But they're my thoughts on fasting.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. Yeah. And also, I guess the idea of like going without something so necessary as food, like it's quite uncomfortable. And I think that's why maybe Western Christianity, we don't like to be uncomfortable, Yep. So maybe that's just me talking, but I feel like it's a deliberate call to discomfort so that we are sort of like almost jerked out of our regular rhythm so that we look again at what's important in life. And so that's sort of where fasting comes in. I tried for a little bit fasting once a week, just fasting on like a Wednesday. It didn't work out in the end. But even just that time that I was doing it, it was helpful. Yeah. I can't exactly remember what I stopped, but still, like now it's sort of an on again, off again thing that I'm still working out and trying to figure out what it looks like maybe more regularly in my life. Yeah. And so this is the thing. I guess I would just encourage people, don't look at, just because we're reading this story and the Pharisees got fasting wrong, this doesn't mean that fasting is an unnecessary discipline and isn't helpful today in the life of church. Yeah. So I guess that's just something I know. I read about fasting for a long time and thought, it's just something Pharisees did. Jesus is like, why bother? But that's not really the context. But really what he's saying is right now, Jesus is with you. So like spend time with him, enjoy being with him. When I'm gone, then will be the time for it,
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So, which flows really well onto the next part. So Jesus answered, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he's with them? They cannot, so as long as they have him, but the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. Obviously here he's referring to like when Jesus is taken away and crucified and then eventually resurrected and then ascends to heaven, so he's kind of like foreshadowing that.
Yeah.
But this really sets up a recurring picture in the Bible of Jesus as the bridegroom and the church as the bride, which is a beautiful picture that continues to get built on and the image like played into throughout the New Testament.
Yeah.
And I guess that sort of connection we should have with Jesus is meant to sort of be that same level of connection that married people have, like a spouse, which is big.
Very big.
Connection. Yeah.
Very deep connection.
And it's really interesting too because like bridegrooms, they're not taken away from weddings. You know, you get this wedding picture, which normally when somebody's married, that's like when they're going to be together forever. But Jesus is like, you'd cry when the groom leaves the wedding. But it's like, well, that doesn't happen in a regular wedding. You know, like normally they're together forever from that point. Everyone's happy. There's no, so I guess, and I read in one of the commentaries that like the verb implies the use of force.
Right, he's been forcibly taken away. Yeah, wow. It's like the celebration gets cut short.
Yeah.
Which is kind of what happened with Jesus on the cross.
It's taken away. So, you know, we get this contrast between death, funeral, mourning, and life and wedding and celebration. Yeah. Yeah. This interesting like interchange of life coming from death and sacrifice. So yeah, I guess there's a really interesting little subtle play on words there. Again, so much of this book is written so intentionally that we just gloss over. Yeah. So yeah, I guess any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, from my reading, there's a couple of things happening here when Jesus is using the bridegroom analogy, because the bridegroom analogy just has in mind the idea of a wedding, and Jewish weddings, they were wild. They were really awesome. I know, like I went to I think 7 weddings last year in 2023.
Whoa.
Yeah, so I went to one about every 6 or 7 weeks, which was pretty wild.
Yeah.
But none of them were like Jewish weddings, because Jewish weddings would go for like 7 days. And they were a really fun and joyous time. And the guests were not expected to do anything except enjoy the food. And that is why, side note, in John chapter 2, when Jesus does his first miracle in the book of John and they run out of wine, it's a big thing, because weddings are meant to be super, super fun. And so, yeah, first and foremost, like a relationship with Jesus is meant to be enjoyed just like a wedding was meant to be enjoyed. So that's a really cool thing, I thought. But yeah, there are a couple of different things happening when Jesus is using this idea of a wedding in regards to his mission. And so a dominant idea of the Pharisees of the Messiah at the time was that the Messiah would come when the world was ready to receive him. And they would be ready to receive the Messiah by the meticulous keeping of the religious law. That is why Pharisees in Scripture were always so focused on making sure that everything that they believed was right, everything that they believed was biblical, because they believed that once everyone got on board with the religious Torah and followed the instruction well, then the Messiah would come, because they were a worthy people of the Messiah. But then Jesus' response to them goes countercultural to what they were believing, because Jesus comes to Israel, he comes to the Jewish people, he says the kingdom of God is coming, but he doesn't do the things that they expected that Messiah to do. Instead of, teaching them Torah observance, he's going and having parties, he's eating with tax collectors and sinners, like we talked about a couple of episodes ago, and he's using an analogy of a really fun feast as opposed to like Torah observance to describe what the Messiah would be like. And so initially he's just really, really rewiring their categories there. And the bridegroom imagery also is interesting, because nowhere in the Bible is the Messiah referred to as a bridegroom.
Interesting.
Nowhere in the Old Testament. The only bridegroom imagery used, marriage imagery used, is between God and Israel in the Old Testament. And so for the Jewish people, they weren't expecting this Messiah figure to talk about himself as God. But Jesus is then now mapping onto himself that imagery that God used in the Old Testament here in the New Testament.
Yep.
And it's reshaping those Messiah categories that they once had. And so immediately Jesus is not just making, a bold assertion of, like, he's not just answering their question about the fasting. He's actually answering their question with a bold assertion about his identity, just by using that one analogy. And I think Jesus just does so much in this one sentence, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, wow, that's really cool. And I guess they had this idea of a Messiah coming as this like warrior Messiah. Whereas this is the way that Jesus is like, well, no, actually I'm coming in love, like a marriage.
Yeah.
So I don't know if they would have, I think this would have been pretty jarring.
Yeah.
Beautiful imagery. All right, we need to keep powering through, or we're going to get, we're going to get just like, those like preachers who just get stuck on one verse and they're like, oh no, I've still got like 30 verses left and only 10 minutes of my sermon. That's never happened to me. No, okay. All right. Awesome. So then he goes on to say, no one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the new piece will pull away the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into an old wineskin. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and both wine and wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins. So I'm not a sewer, nor am I into wine, really. So
this doesn't apply.
They go a little bit over my head. But I was actually talking to somebody about this who they like to patch jeans.
Okay.
Yeah, and they were like, oh yeah, I've been caught in this before. Like, you have to wash the jeans before you patch them because otherwise the new patch, like jeans shrink in the wash and the patch will like shrink differently than the rest of the jeans, so it'll rip it. And I'm like, oh, that's still like a thing. They're like, so it's the exact same thing. It's like a new patch.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Which I found interesting. And the same with the wineskin. So ancient Palestine, wine was kept in goatskin containers. And the new grape juice would ferment over time and stretch the containers. So an old bag would not be able to withstand the pressure and would burst. And so a new bag is recommended for it because, it would actually have the flexibility to expand.
Yep.
So I guess this is, again, Jesus emphasizing that his way is new and you can't just stuff it into the old way of doing it. You have to approach this with a new mindset. Like what you're saying, like, actually my way is meant to be a way of joy. And a wedding celebration. It's meant to be a way of like love and care for people instead of just mindless religion. And so this is sort of the new one. I guess you can take this a lot of ways. It's very sort of open for reflection. But, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, reading stuff like this, I don't know if you're in a similar boat, but for me, stuff like this would come up where Jesus says, the old can't mix with the new. And you have in mind this idea of like the Old Testament. And so, and maybe you've heard those that are listening on this podcast, some preachers speak about, this verses like this invalidate the Old Testament and make us realize that we don't need it anymore. And, I kind of struggled with that for a bit, but reading the context of what is happening here, Jesus is not necessarily saying that the Old Testament and stuff is the thing that he's throwing away. What he's actually addressing in this passage is actually the traditions and the cultures that were getting in the way of people experiencing a relationship with God. And I think what he's actually doing is getting rid of culture that is toxic to people's relationship with God by saying, if you want to follow me, you actually need to unlearn old habits, you need to unlearn old practices and unlearn the old things that actually kept you from knowing who God really is, so that you can appreciate the newness of life that I'm offering you. Because these Pharisees, they were fasting, like you said, Mondays and Thursdays. They were ticking off all these boxes and whatnot, but they missed the mark of what it actually means to be a follower of God. And Jesus is here saying, you need to actually unlearn those things so that you can learn my new way, and my new way doesn't actually mix with your way. So it's a challenge to us as well in the modern day, because so many people have an idea of who God is in their brain. And if you want to know Jesus, you actually need to be willing to let go of the assumptions that you have or the presuppositions that you have, so that you can walk in the newness and discover what he actually wants to be known by. So I think that's what this story is actually addressing here.
Yeah, absolutely. I love in the Andrew's study Bible notes, I love the way it words it. Jesus uses this illustration to emphasize that his way was new and would not fit into the old, discredited ways of the Pharisees, and even within some of the limitations of Mosaic laws. I think about this as a couple of years ago, I started running, which was great, until my knee started really hurting on runs and would just start hurting all the time, which was not good.
Yeah.
So I had to go to a physio and, did x-rays and all that sort of stuff with my knee. And essentially there was nothing wrong with my knee, but my muscles were so used to me walking in a particular way that when I started running more, the muscles were putting unnecessary tension on a different part of my knee and it was causing problems.
Yeah, right.
So my physio said, it's like your body wants to run, you've got the energy and the muscle to do it, but the actual structure is just a bit off and it's not working with the new rhythm that you're trying to implement.
Yeah, right.
So I had to get all of these little small random exercises to retrain and rebalance my muscles to get used to walking in a slightly new way so that when I would run, there wouldn't be pain.
Yeah.
Putting very technical things into very simple language because I'm not a physio. But essentially I had to just sit there and do these really random movements up and down with my leg and like these kind of things because certain muscles had to be strengthened to like reshape the muscle. Yeah. Or how the leg moves. And eventually I could start running and there was no pain.
Yeah.
But I had to relearn how to, I had to go back and relearn to walk in a right way so that I could run in a better way.
Whoa.
And I think this is kind of what Jesus is all about. We have these pictures and these ruts that we get stuck in of what religion looks like, what Christianity is meant to look like, even how we read and interpret the Bible. And sometimes we just get so stuck in it that our very walking is problematic.
Yep.
And then when we really want to follow Jesus and run, we're like, why is this not working? Because, Jesus is, you've got to go back. You've got to relearn the pictures. Just listen to my voice and listen to what I have to say about this and follow my ways. And then all of it will make sense. We're not getting rid of all the old stuff, but you've just misinterpreted it and misunderstood it. And we need to reframe this so that you can run in my ways.
That is such a great analogy. I'm glad that you experienced pain. I'm glad because that actually puts it in a perfect analogy there.
Thanks, yeah. Physios, man. They are a godsend.
Change your life.
All right, mate. Any physio listening? I love and respect you so much. You're amazing people. Okay.
All right. We'll move on to the next story.
Yeah. You want to lead us?
Sure. So the next story is one of the two Sabbath controversies that happened. And Sabbath, pretty big deal to the Jewish people.
Yeah. And to us.
And to Seventh-day Adventists too.
Yes, we are Seventh. I know not everybody listening to this is Seventh-day Adventists, but we are Seventh-day Adventists, and so we've had a lot of stuff to talk about with Sabbath over our lives.
Yes. So Sabbath was a big deal. Sabbath was instigated in Genesis by God himself. It was re-emphasized in the Ten Commandments. And for Jews in Jesus' world, the Sabbath had a mixture of social and legal implications. And so they believed that to keep Sabbath was the greatest marker to the world that they were God's people. And it was kind of like a national flag. People had, some countries have national flags. Some people have like different emblems. For the Jewish people, Sabbath is their emblem. It's their national flag. It's their pride and joy of this is what it means for us to be the Jewish people. We keep Sabbath. And so it's pretty big. It's a pretty big thing. And because it's a pretty big thing, they kind of, like later Pharisees, later rabbis and teachers of the law, had a look at the Torah where the Sabbath is initiated. And they kind of put safeguards around the Sabbath so that people wouldn't accidentally break the Sabbath, because keeping the Sabbath was super important. For those that don't know what Sabbath observance requires, it's literally a day off work, which is pretty good. Like, it's not actually a bad thing. Sabbath is the best. It's actually the best day of the week. Yeah. It's a time where the Jewish people were instructed to, not work, allow your slaves to not work, allow your animals to not work, let everyone just take a break and enjoy it. And it's actually a blessing from God. And so in order to protect that sanctity of what the Sabbath is, they actually came up with 39 different rules to safeguard the Sabbath day. Yeah, wow.
And initially it was just rest and keep it holy, which is
pretty broad.
Because it's like, if I say I'm not going to work, if I'm a photographer, if I take a photo on the day, is that work? You know what I mean? Like, I think it can be pretty hard to wrestle with. So I'm sure. Yeah. Anyway.
And so the 39 rules, they included stuff like not hunting, not butchering, not plowing one's field, and the amount of distance someone is able to walk, for example. And so the 39 rules were helpful for guiding people of, all right, this is what it means to keep the Sabbath holy. But as things happen over time, rules get extrapolated, more questions get answered. And so there were different interpretations of what Sabbath keeping looked like. And some people went to different extremes. There is one example where some people were even forbidden to set a dislocated foot or hand on the Sabbath day because that counts as work.
Oh.
I don't know, dude. I would be pretty upset
Like come back in a few hours.
come back in a few hours when the sun sets, and then we'll set your dislocated arm.
Yep.
I don't know. That was in one of the Jewish texts back in the day.
Brutal.
And so the Sabbath was a very comprehensive day with a lot of comprehensive rules. And by Jesus' time, it wasn't a blessing. It was actually a burden for many people. And that is the context in which we find ourselves when we enter into verse 23.
Yep. Yeah, pretty interesting too, I guess, on this verse. I didn't realize this until kind of reading in, but like if you're just looking at like the Torah, like the guidance on Sabbath keeping, what they were doing wasn't actually wrong. So the law permitted anyone, particularly the needy, to pluck ears in a neighbour's field of standing grain as long as they didn't use a sickle. That's in Deuteronomy 23:25.
Yep.
So they weren't actually breaking the Sabbath because that's all they were doing. They were just
Yeah.
plucking some bits of grain.
Yeah, the disciples were walking through grain fields, just plucking some grain and eating it, which is a pretty nice snack.
Yeah, I mean, I've never had raw grain, I don't think.
I'll be honest, me either. But the commentator that I read in brackets said, "It's actually a tasty snack." And so I thought, I'm gonna just drop that tidbit in there.
Yeah, some commentators are wild. I love them. Okay. But the Pharisees classified it as harvesting and a violation of the Sabbath. You know, so it's kind of like, but the Bible doesn't actually say it's a problem. You've just made it a problem.
So once again, it's an example of the Pharisees' laws that they were breaking, not necessarily the biblical laws.
Yeah. I don't know. It might, I don't know. I just never thought about this, I guess, this particular line, but I guess it just makes me so much more like frustrated. I'm just like, why are you guys making such a big deal out of this? They clearly didn't have like food. They were hungry. Like they fit the category fine, you know, and they're going about the work of God or whatever. Well, you know, I guess the Pharisees didn't think they were going about the work of God, but yeah. And so I guess like this is just an example of how you can see the comparison of how this maybe used to be a really restorative time for people, but all of a sudden it's become a burden because even this little allowance for somebody has been taken away.
Yeah.
Instead of this time. Yeah, I don't know. So it's kind of sad.
So in verse 24, the Pharisees got up to the disciples and said, "What are you doing? Why are you doing the unlawful thing on the Sabbath?" But I love verse 25 because Jesus defends his Pharisees, defends his disciples.
Yep.
And I think that's awesome. That even though it's the disciples doing the wrong thing in their eyes, Jesus is like, you know what, boys, I've got you.
Hold me back, not just
Hold me back.
Yeah.
So Jesus compares what the disciples, and he is allowing the disciples to do with something that happened in the Old Testament with King David. So back in the day, in 1 Samuel 21, there is a story where David is on the run from King Saul. So King Saul is trying to kill David, and King Saul is trying to kill David because he's super jealous of who David is. David is going to be the king one day. Saul's not kind of keen for that. And so he's doing everything he can to kind of take David out. And so David arrives at the priest's headquarters at the temple. At the tabernacle. They didn't have a temple at the time. And there was some special bread that only they were allowed to eat as priests. But when David and his men came along, because the priest saw the need, there was an exception made for David and his men, and they were able to eat the bread so that they were able to survive and live there, which I think is super good. And when Jesus compares himself to David in this way, it's super, super important. I just want to read what N.T. Wright says about this because it really just blew my mind, because I've read this analogy before and I thought it doesn't really fit because David wasn't keeping Sabbath, so it's not a Sabbath issue, but N.T. Wright explains it for me. So Jesus puts himself on par with King David in a period when David, already anointed by Samuel, but not yet enthroned because Saul was king, was on the run, gathering support and waiting for his time to come. That's a pretty heavy claim. The implication is that Jesus is a true king, marked out by God, but not yet recognized and enthroned. He therefore has the right, when he and his people are hungry, to pass by the normal regulations. In other words, this kind of Sabbath breaking, so far from being an act of casual or wanton civil disobedience, is a deliberate sign, like the refusal to fast in the previous story, a sign that the king is here, that the kingdom is breaking in, and that instead of waiting for the old creation to come to its point of rest, the new creation is already bursting upon the old world.
Wow.
That just blew my categories.
That
Analogy between David being a king but not yet enthroned, and Jesus a king but not yet enthroned. And Jesus is kind of making a claim to the Pharisees here. He's not just defending the Pharisees' actions, he's actually using the analogy of King David to make a claim about himself again. I am a king that's not yet enthroned, just like David was. And David was able to have those allowances. So if you believe in me, I'm also able to do these kind of things too.
Wow.
So it's pretty bold. It's a bold claim that Jesus is making in this story. So thanks, N.T. Wright.
Good old N.T. Wright, man.
Good old N.T.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, wow, I had no idea. There's a lot of comparisons between David and Jesus that are really interesting, but I'd never seen that one before, so that's really cool. And then he makes this big claim. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, and so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.
Tell me about it. I feel like you're cooking right now. What have you got?
Yeah, I got a little something. Okay. Okay, so the Son of Man is a really interesting title that gets, like, Jesus uses it quite often, and I guess it's got some interesting. I don't have time to fully go into the title. We have talked a bit about it. I think you did a really great exposition on the Son of Man title.
Yeah, I think in episode 3.
Yeah. So go back and listen to that if you guys want to know. Okay. So I'm just going to read this quote again from Andrew's Study Bible because it's really good.
Yep.
At issue in this debate with the Pharisees is not whether the Sabbath should be observed or abolished. Nowhere in the New Testament is there any statement that Jesus abolished the observance of the seventh-day Sabbath. The issue at hand is how the Sabbath should be observed and who has the authority to make that determination. So just pausing for a moment, I guess what we're getting here is that Jesus is framing himself as having this authority around Sabbath, right? So for the Pharisees, the traditions spelled out by their rabbis were the authority. Jesus claimed ultimate authority, for he is the creator of Sabbath. He is Lord of the Sabbath, right? Thus, it is the Lord's day. For Jesus, as illustrated in his actions, mercy, relief of pain and suffering, and filling basic needs determine the legitimacy of appropriate Sabbath work. So he sees Sabbath as a time of redemption of creation, you know. And here we go. This is my tie-in to Good Morning Eden. Just a little frame for you guys. So in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, obviously, part of his creation on the seventh day was to not actually create, but it was almost like an anti-create. It was to rest, and he, in doing that, created rest. And that was meant to be a time when creation could just be, where things could be restored. And that's why in the Old Testament you see things about how, like, it's not just the Israelites who should rest, it's also their servants and even their animals, even their fields.
Yeah.
It's meant to actually be a time when things can be restored, but instead it'll become a burden. And so this is the idea. And I love what Abraham Heschel talks about this. I don't know if you had a Heschel quote.
I didn't.
Okay. Abraham Heschel, I haven't read the whole thing, but he has this little book on the Sabbath. Everyone should read it. It's amazing. I say that as somebody who hasn't read the whole thing, but the parts I have read are amazing. Anyway, but he talks about how other religions in the world, they have sacred spaces, like a temple that you walk into. Whereas what God set up is actually a sacred time. It's like a temple built into time. 6 days work, 1 day rest. And it's a rhythm that is built into the very creation of the world. And when you enter into that space, you are entering in under the lordship of Jesus because he's claimed to be Lord over the Sabbath. So it's like in that space, you are surrendering yourself to the kingship of Jesus again and submitting to his authority. But in his authority, he is not putting more burden on you to do more. Instead, he's actually releasing burden from you and telling you to be restored, to go back to Eden when you could just be with your king, be with your God. So every Sabbath morning, you can literally say, "Good morning, Eden," because that's what you are waking up to every time.
Wow.
That in that time, instead of having this burden of having and gaining more and trying to do more, all the burdens can be released because you're not working and you're resting and you're keeping it set apart from the rest of your week. And so in being Lord of the Sabbath, every time I step into Sabbath, I'm stepping into the domain of Jesus.
Yeah. That is incredible.
Isn't that like a wild thought?
Yeah, it's almost like you kind of summarizing what you're saying, true Sabbath observance of keeping the Sabbath is actually meant to bring us back to that Garden of Eden ideal.
Yeah.
And so any time on Saturday that we're actually not experiencing restoration or feeling joyful or happy, it's almost like we've missed the point of Sabbath. And we need to recalibrate ourselves to figuring out, well, what is actually keeping me from experiencing that Good Morning Eden ideal moment? Because, yeah, like you said, it's meant to be a time of joy. It's meant to be a time of restoration. And if you're not restored on a Sunday when you wake up, then you've missed something on the Saturday.
Yeah. And it's and I guess I think a point to make there is that it's not meant to just even be like a temporary joy kick, like we might just go on go on Facebook for like 15 minutes to get a big dopamine hit. But it's things about what's actually going to bring you real lasting restoring. Maybe instead of going on like social media, it's actually to turn the phone off for the time. Or, maybe it's you just actually need to escape and go to the mountains, go look at, go to the beach. That's, man, I feel so restored every time I even just see the ocean for me.
Yep.
And so I guess, maybe just have some time, like when you're next keeping Sabbath, think about like, how restored am I feeling? Like, what do I need to do to make this a really restoring time? Like deep restoration, not shallow restoration. Good thoughts. Like Sabbath was made for man. It's not meant to be another burden to keep. It's meant to be a gift to be received.
Yep. That's so true. Well, we'll transition to the final story, which is also about the Sabbath.
Yep.
And in this final story, there is a man with a shriveled hand, which is significant first and foremost because kind of similar to the leper, if you had a shriveled hand, you were also not allowed to go into certain places. You weren't allowed into social interactions with normal people. And so again, we're getting a picture of a social outcast that Jesus is being tested with, which is pretty sad when you think about it. Like, imagine that guy, you know what I mean? Like knowing that I'm not meant to be here, but the only reason why I am is because I'm being used as a pawn.
Yep. But what I love even more is that Jesus makes him like stand up in front of everyone. It's like maybe he could have been like subtle and hid the hand under his jacket or something, but Jesus is like, hey, can you just stand up here for a minute? Like, I imagine the way I'm like imagining this is like, if I was on my way to church and then like, I like was super hungry, so I was eating something in the car on the way there because I was in a rush because I'm a pastor and I'm, whatever. Yep. Like I was on my way there and then like on the way over, I accidentally spilt my green smoothie all over my top.
Over a white shirt.
And then I'm like, okay, I'm just going to put a jacket on and I'm going to sit there. I don't have to preach today, so I can just sit and no one will notice. And then the preacher's like, hey, Josh, can you just stand up in front of everybody for a minute and show us your top or whatever? Like just look at this thing that made you feel like you shouldn't come.
Yep.
He's standing there and you have to keep standing there while he talks. Like this is like, okay, just stand up, stretch out your hand and everyone's like, whoa.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, little detour the way I think about the story, but go on, please, Josh.
Yeah, well, like you said, he's been made to stand up in front of everyone, and then Jesus challenges the crowd and challenges the Pharisees that are trying to test him by asking them a question: what's lawful to do on the Sabbath? Is it good to do good or to do evil, to save life or kill it? And so, it's interesting that he says that, the idea that he couldn't be healed is an interesting one because, like we said before, on Sabbath, if it's a life or death thing, people could address it. But if it wasn't a life or death thing, then it kind of just waited until later. And so the fact that they're trying to heal this guy isn't the point of the story. It's when they're trying to heal this guy. It's on the Sabbath.
Yep.
And it's interesting because the first section has to do with the man with the shriveled hand. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil? That has to do with him. But this idea of to save life or to kill, one of the commentators that I read is kind of implying that that is meant for Jesus. Because after this story in verse 6, it says that the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. And so Jesus is kind of from the get-go kind of highlighting their intention of you actually have impure motives of what you're doing here. And yes, so you're using this guy as a pawn, but you're really trying to get to me. And he's exposing them. And that is why they remained silent when Jesus asked them the question. They just didn't know what to do. And yeah, it's interesting. Did you have anything that you wanted to say on any of that?
No, I find it like so interesting that, I guess even just that question when he's just like, which is lawful to do, so to do good or to evil, to save a life or to kill. Like, no one's going to be like, save a life or kill. Like, no one's going to answer that. But the fact that they remained silent, that's what made Jesus like get angry and deeply distressed. He's like, are you serious? Like, you all know the answer to this question, but you're choosing to stay silent because you don't want to give yourself away, you know? Like, it's like a huge injustice, obviously.
Yeah.
So, I can totally resonate with Jesus' frustration there because I would feel that too. You know, if you call someone out and then they just refuse to answer, like, I don't know. I think we've all been in that situation.
Yeah, James Edwards, I just want to read a quote from him that I thought was really, really good. It says, Mark's description of Jesus' anger at the callousness of the observers is graphic and passionate. He uses 3 strong Greek words that appear nowhere else in the gospel, that being angry, being deeply distressed, and being deeply distressed at their stubborn heart. So those 3 words in the Greek are very strong words. The word translated stubborn does not mean malicious as much as an unwillingness to understand. So basically he's saying they weren't willing to understand who Jesus was. They were just trying to trip him up. Nor is such stubbornness isolated to Jesus' opponents. It is equally described in his own disciples a little bit later when they're misunderstanding his ministry and his mission. To summarize, Jesus' anger is a description of righteous indignation. The greatest enemy of divine love and justice is not opposition, not even malice, but the hardness of heart and indifference to divine grace. Wild. Whoa. The biggest opposition to the love of Jesus isn't malice, isn't even hatred. It's the hardness of heart and indifference to grace.
Man, what a convicting sentence. I'm just sitting there like, oh man, how hard is my heart today? You know, like that's, wow.
So I actually love the fact that Jesus gets angry in Scripture, because whenever you look at what he gets angry at, it's never at people making mistakes in the sense of like moral failings. Yeah. It's always anger at when they don't understand who he is, because it's not to his detriment, it's actually to their own detriment. So he's actually getting angry at like, man, they just don't get me. And if they get me, they would actually have the best life ever. Yes. But they're just not getting me. Like, just get me, please. And I just love that idea about Jesus. Like, he's not angry at us. In fact, he gets angry for us because we miss out on life and life of abundance when we miss out on who Jesus actually is. And that's kind of one of the challenges of this story for me.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, totally. And I guess what I love about this story too, similar to the leper, like the healing actually has a lot to do with just worship. Like, he's not healing just so the guy can have a good time. He heals him so that he can re-enter worship and re-enter that community to God, you know? Like, I imagine for so long he would have felt that withered hand, that he was just not welcome at the table with God.
Yep.
But Jesus heals him of it and he welcomed him to the table even before that, but like he welcomes him even with his brokenness and whatever else is going on. Whereas the Pharisees just didn't have room for that. And so I guess this for me, like, it's a really, again, it's Jesus welcoming in the outcast and bringing healing not to impress people, not just, I'm sure it did impress people, but it's not for that.
Yeah.
It was for releasing the chains that like this world of sin has put on people. And so that, again, people could come back to that Eden experience of walking with God again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that brings us to the end of the passages. Before we wrap up, any big ideas or thoughts that challenged you?
Yeah, look, again, we mentioned this before, but as a pastor and like, especially a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, our Saturdays our Sabbaths can be very full of stuff. And I love the stuff I get to do, don't get me wrong. But I guess this is just another conviction for me to look at the way I spend Sabbath again and to pray over it and really try and think through, is this bringing restoration to me? Is this bringing restoration to those around me? And what might it look like? Like, is there a way to do it differently? Is there a way to think through it that might be more restorative for me or for other people? Like, how can I use my Sabbath even to bring restoration to others? And I think that it is already happening in my life in a number of ways, but it's just that thinking again and convicting again that, again, this is meant to be a gift for us as people, not a burden. Am I giving that gift? Am I receiving that gift? And am I giving that gift to others?
Yeah.
I guess there's some big things I'm thinking through as I've read this, and I just love looking at the way Jesus kept Sabbath. Yeah, so it was really awesome to look through that again. What about you?
Yeah, for me, it's been such an awesome experience. I have never gone so deep into a book like this before.
Yeah.
And kind of just going, literally like reading a commentary or a couple of commentaries, one story at a time, and kind of just seeing the progressive narrative of what what Mark is actually portraying Jesus to be. And yeah, just, for me, I think this week I've kind of realized through the 3 stories that we've looked at today, how deeply Jesus is trying to recategorize our understandings of him. And I think it's just a reminder for me this week to not assume that we know everything about Jesus. Because I think that so often we can think, oh, we've read this story, we know what this is about. And we just miss the mark with it. But man, just taking time to look at the stories and being like, hold on, Jesus is actually, in 2 of these stories, he's actually making claims to divinity here. And I never even noticed it before because I just, I know this story, I'm going to move on.
Yeah.
And so it's just a real reminder just to, for me anyway, just to stop, to sit with it, to see what Jesus is saying about himself. And then to not run away from that, but to actually just think about, well, how does that actually change things for me? And just to sit with it for a while. So yeah, that's my kind of big thoughts. Yeah, beautiful. Let's do some reflection questions for those listening along or watching the video. Do you want to start us off, Josh? Yes, sure thing. So the first question for reflection today is, are there areas in your life that you need to focus less on rules and more on relationships?
And a question from me. What's your withered hand keeping you from community or making you feel like you need to be distant from God? Do you need healing, releasing, or just to be reminded that you're welcome to the table with Jesus again?
And finally, in what sense can you recapture the true spirit of Sabbath without falling into legalism? Well, that brings us to the end of another Good Morning Eden episode. Please leave a comment. Please leave a review. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if this is helping you, we'd love to know how we can help you even more. But to finish out today, we just pray that you start to see things a little bit more clearly in the way that God wanted you to see them, and that you may start having those good morning moments in your life where you start to see things in brand new ways that add value to your life. So I'm Josh, this is Josh. Peace out, and we'll see you next week. Bye.